Hello, and welcome to Wallace's Mysteries of Antiquity. Like the video and subscribe to this channel to explore the enigmas of our distant ancestors and try to come to tentative conclusions about them. Before we begin, I have made a small upgrade to my format. I've always linked my sources in the description, but you had no way of knowing which claim went to which source. So now they are numbered, and you will see the same numbers in brackets in the corner as a reference. If you see a 0, it means it's my own insights. My last video, where I theorized about the minimum technology required to build a pyramid, I concluded that the technological requirements were Stone Age, so long as you knew some clever tricks. The Egyptians are chronologically comfortably in the Bronze Age. Therefore, so are their oldest pyramids. So logically, one might conclude that I may have missed something, but I didn't, and today we're going to see the proof. At the end of the last ice age, when the land bridge between Russia and Alaska was swallowed by the Pacific, humanity's technological progression forked into two separate paths. The Afro-Eurasian section of humanity is the one you're probably most familiar with if you're a fan of my channel. It includes the Egyptians, the Greco-Romans, Mesopotamia, India, China, and everything in between. These groups acted as one, connected by land and navigable seas. It might take decades or centuries, but when one group entered the Bronze or Iron Age, they all did. But on the other side of the world, no Metal Ages ever happened. Hidden in the jungles of the Americas are glorious monuments to the genius of the human species. Rising from the jungle floor, you will find the mighty Pyramid of Cholula. At 4.5 million cubic meters, it is the biggest pyramid human hands had ever constructed. Compare that to Giza's Great Pyramid in the number 2 spot at a measly 2.5 million. A little further north, you will find the subject of today's video, one of the 7 wonders of the world, El Castillo, the Pyramid of Chichen Itza. It is a marvel of engineering, and although beauty is subjective, in my opinion, it is the most beautiful of humanity's pyramids, and it was created by a Stone Age civilization. While I assure you the focus of my channel will be Egypt, sometimes it may help us to conceptualize things they did by looking at a similar structure made by less technologically advanced peoples. The Mayans, despite being in the Stone Age, lived 3,000 years closer in time to us, so we have both remarkably preserved structures and lots of writing. Unlike the Egyptians, the Mayan told us how they built their pyramids. Since I assume the majority of my subscribers may be less familiar with them, I will spend a few slides giving you a brief overview and separate some myths from facts. Firstly, there was no Mayan empire. They were city-states like ancient Greece. Cities had their own kings, and individual power waxed and waned, as did their rivalries and allegiances. Cities were not planned and grew organically, mostly flattened out by hand. You'll notice how flat Chichen Itza is in pictures. This is not modern terraforming for tourists. This is how their cities looked, though I imagine there was shrubbery here instead of grass. Trees were very destructive to architecture, so they were kept to the outskirts. The people seemed free to migrate, and the power was largely won by people voting by moving, though of course war and conquest happened too. They competed more with economics and by building. Unlike most civilizations, the Mayans didn't need aqueducts to get faraway water into their cities. They had the opposite problem of rain nearly every day, so if you visit, hidden under your feet are countless corbelled tunnels, built to funnel excess water out of cities. They were masters of water and could even make indoor pressure. They did not appear to have used wheels, but there are plenty of toys showing that they at least understood the concept. The rough terrain made it impractical, though individual axles have been found. They had no beasts of burden, no horses, camels, oxen, or donkeys. Everything they accomplished was done by human hands. Manual labor was an important feature of their religion and culture. As well as taxes, citizens of a city owed their king several days of manual labor per year, which is what gave these kings the consistent workforce required to construct their cities. This guy is using a wooden mallet and a stone chisel to carve a rock. Their gods primarily lived in the underworld, which could be accessed via cenotes. There are no rivers or lakes in the Yucatan. Rain and those cenotes were the only source of fresh water, and to keep it coming, the humans owed a debt of blood to the gods, and their kings were closely associated with them, much like pharaohs. The stories you're probably thinking of are not exaggerations. They were as obsessed with death as the ancient Egyptians, if not more so. They believed the blood of their sacrifices fed their gods, and human blood was the most precious thing they could offer. This is the bottom of the nearby cenote, and those are exactly what they look like. Most pyramids of the Mayans are temples, but it's a misconception that none of them are tombs. Some powerful kings were buried within. This tunnel is accessed via a removable floor stone and entombs a king in an ornate sarcophagus that I'm showing you, as well as 6 human sacrifices. While their technology was primitive, their science was very advanced. In what's called the Temple of Inscriptions, as well as several codex that survived the wrath of Christian friars, we see a civilization with geometry that rivaled the Greeks and a number system that included 0, which let them calculate things that even the Europeans couldn't at the time. In my last video, I mentioned using a rope to make a Pythagorean triangle. While there are a lot of ways to make a right angle, why would I choose this one? One, well, because it's the simplest, but mostly because I know it works. The Mayans told us this is how they did it. The great observatory next to the pyramid has windows perfectly set to observe the movements of Sun, Moon, and Venus, and I'll show you later how far they would take this understanding. One more piece of trivia that you'll want to know before looking at the pyramid itself is their calendar. They had 2 of them that ran simultaneously. A solar calendar called the Hab, which governed most of life as it reliably told them when to plant crops and such, and they divided this up into 18 months of 20 days each. You might have noticed that's 360 days. They had 5 additional days where they basically hunkered down because they believed evil spirits were roaming the earth during these days. That leads nicely to the 240-day spiritual cycle called the Zulkan, which covered certain religious activities. Together, these calendars complete a cycle every 52 years, which they celebrated like a century, often with a building project. The reason the Cholula Pyramid is so huge is because it was expanded 8 times. That leads us to Chichen Itza itself. So let's look at a little history of the site and the archaeology that's happened there. Although pottery has been found in the area dating back at least 2,000 years, the city itself seemed to have gotten started around 400 AD. From 800 to 1050, the city was at the height of its power, at about 50,000 people, and it was around this time that the pyramid was constructed. It had 2 expansions, which we'll get to, likely at the beginning or end of different cycles. They cut limestone by hand with obsidian and carried several 100-pound blocks in what's called a tump, which is basically a wrap that went around the forehead and allowed them to carry large stones on their back. For stones that were too large to be carried in this way, they were dragged. All the blocks are significantly smaller than those of Egyptian pyramids. Religious buildings, as well as a lot of others, were painted red by the Mayans. They also used white, yellow, green, and black for civic buildings. Blue was the color of the gods and impressed the Europeans because it was very hard for them to make. You Minecraft players know that you can make blue dye by grinding lapis lazuli, which is what the Europeans did and is pretty hard. Or you can do it with a blue flower, which the Mayans had growing everywhere in the form of wild indigo. By the time the Spanish arrived in 1527, the city had been long abandoned, although the temple seems to have still been in use. It's not clear where the nearby Mayan population was living when they met the Spanish. When the Mayans realized they were being invaded, they did manage to push the Spanish back, but they came back with more ships, and by 1588, Chichen Itza was a Spanish cattle ranch. Around the same time, a great tragedy happened. What's going on in Spain in the late 1500s? Yeah, the Mayans were subject to the horrors of the Inquisition. On July 12, 1562, Friar Diego de Landa destroyed most Mayan books and thousands of images. Luckily, 3.5 survived, as well as any that remained in unknown lost cities. Many of the Mayan cities had already been lost to the jungle, even to the Mayans themselves. The next European to be said to have visited Chichen Itza is John Lloyd Stephens. You may know this name considering he visited the Giza pyramids just before Perrin did. Many modern sources say that in his book Incidents of Travel in Yucatan, he described Chichen Itza. If you make documentaries, don't reference an old source, but then not actually read it. I've linked the full PDF below. He does mention Chichen Itza, but everyone who says he visited or described it is wrong, and either didn't read it or didn't do so carefully. He wrote a second book about Yucatan, which I've also linked. I thought maybe someone just mistook which book it was in, but it's not described in there either. He does not appear to have ever seen Chichen Itza. Desiree Charnay took the first photographs of the site in the early 1860s. Minor excavations and explorations were done by Augustus Le Plongeon and his wife in 1875, and Tolbert Muller and Alfred Maudslay in 1880s. In 1894, U.S. Consul to the Yucatan, Edward Thompson, purchased the whole site and spent the next 30 years exploring it, discovering ancient inscriptions, clothing, weapons, etc. from pre-Columbian Mayans. Here it is just before his purchase, photographed in 1892. In the 19-teens and early 20s, the Cambridge Institute began excavation and reconstruction of the site. The First World War and Mexican revolutions both put some delays on it. Both of these pictures were dated from 1905. In 1926, Thompson was charged with stealing artifacts from the sacred cenote. But in 1944, this was thrown out by the Mexican Supreme Court, arguing that he couldn't steal something from land that he owned. Though he had passed away by this point, the land was returned to his heirs. Their heirs immediately sold the land to tourism pioneer Fernando Peon, who had already been instrumental to the tourism business of the Yucatan. He owned the land until the Federal Law over Monuments and Archaeological, Artistic, and Historic Sites Act, which put all monuments under federal ownership. The site has continued to grow in popularity as infrastructure around it was built and the nearby Cancun became Mexico's hottest tourist spot. That's the history, according to Wikipedia and the Mexican tour guides you will find there, as well as what's parroted by YouTubers and even the National Geographic. I was ready to write the script and be done. I was just skimming through some other languages to make sure I didn't miss anything. Then I found something like a conspiracy. No biggie, I find them all the time. Let's dispel it and move on. Who is this guy? Wait, this is a credible historian. And he has receipts. There are about 20 very critical years missing from that story I told you. It looks like the early Mexican government messed something up and tried to cover it up. Remember when ancient architects sounded the alarm that the Egyptians were considering recasing Menkauri's pyramid? All of the archaeological problems that would come from that? Mostly that you couldn't be sure where each block went, and some would be missing and have to be replaced. And in 100 years, archaeologists might not be able to even remember which blocks were original and which ones were new. There is a huge difference between restoring something, which is just putting the pieces back in place, and reconstruction, like you can see here in 1922. A lot of the casing stones, stairs, and even balustrades had been removed by the Mayans to build other things centuries ago. This is a reconstruction, and the stones themselves are not 1,000-year-old Mayan limestone blocks, but 100-year-old Mexican ones. There doesn't seem to be any surviving documentation to which stones are new and which ones aren't. In places like Greece, missing stones are replaced with concrete, not mistakable for original stone. Even a layman can see the difference, but here they just used local limestone. In 1910, the first construction started, making a new staircase out of pre-existing blocks found around the pyramid that you can see here on the left. But later, this was torn out, and by 1920, a completely fresh staircase had been built from scratch you can see on the right. so most of the stones on the outside are not original. They were built in the 1920s. But you can see some of them in these older images. You can see the panels and corners of the steps, so although the stones themselves are modern, the design seems to correctly extrapolate from what was originally there under the brush. It appears to me that the reconstruction only actually affected half of the pyramid, and that the southeast side was left in its deteriorated state. This pictured from the famous Charles Lindbergh in 1929 shows the reconstruction nearly completed. So while keeping all of that in mind, let's take a quick peek at the outside features before going inside. This is what the unreconstructed face looked like in 1973, which it still somewhat does, so if you visit, you can still see original stones around the back. The backside looks a lot more like what the whole pyramid used to look like. For example, these tourist shots from the 1920s, just before the real reconstruction started. Normally, I don't like talking about numerology, because if you look hard enough, you can derive constants from anything. I mean, look at this golden ratio crap. Literally all of this is dependent on the camera being exactly where it is and nowhere else. But in the Mayans' case, they actually wrote down what everything means. It has 9 steps, split by stairs on all 4 sides. This gives you 18 step faces of each side of the pyramid, representing 18 months. There are 5 statues on top of each side of the temple, representing the 5 bad days, and if you count all 4 sides together, you get 20 days for each month. If you count the rectangular reliefs on both sides, it'll come to 52, the number of cycles in the 2 calendars. In this picture, you can get a clear contrast between the reconstruction and the original faces. On each of the 4 staircases, there are 91 steps, and when including the single step up into the pyramid, that comes out to 365, solidifying the calendar numerology. It's unusual for a Mayan pyramid to have 4 staircases. Most of them just have 1 in the front. If you clap in front of the pyramid, it will respond back with a sound similar to the call of a quetzal, which is a local bird. Personally, I don't believe this was intentional. I think the same thing would happen if you clapped in front of Djoser's pyramid if it was in better shape. It's created from the 9 steps all echoing back at you at a slightly different offset. It seems like more of a happy side effect of the step structure. During the equinox, the shadow of the steps project on the balustrade to make a snake that connects to the head at the base. This is one of the most famous features of the pyramid. And it might not have been intended either. The pattern was first noticed in 1927 by the reconstructors, but they did not consider it important because they believed they had considerably changed the shape of the pyramid. It wasn't until the 1970s where this feature started being talked about. It's the biggest day for tourists, so it's a feature the Mexican government heavily promotes. When comparing old and new pictures of both the edge of the steps and the balustrade, I can't be sure that this shadow trick was original or not. It's a shame that we don't have measurements from before reconstruction. The angle of the pyramid also seems to be aligned to nearby cenote, about 20 degrees from north-south, so its alignment to project the snake may be a coincidence. Lastly, while the equinox is where most tourists go to watch this event, it's visible for several weeks before and after. So if you go, you don't need to worry about being there on a specific day, just any bright day near the equinox. So that's the pro tip to avoid big crowds. It's just a shadow on the side, and the sun doesn't move that much that it's visible for only one day. So while the Mexicans say this was intended, the best I'm willing to put my name on is maybe it was intended. Their astronomic and geometric abilities did allow them to have done this on purpose, but I'm going with maybe. On top of the pyramid is a temple with this floor plan. 3 rooms topped by a corbelled ceiling. Not like Egyptian corbelling. These are cut flat. Mayan ceilings were triangular. I'm not sure what this outer section was for, but the inner part was a shrine where 2 statues originally were placed. These were chalk-mold statues that were used as part of sacrificial rituals. I'll show you another one later. We're lucky this temple exists at all. Many Mayan pyramids have nothing on top. The original temples, once made of wood, had either been taken down or rotted away in the jungle. It's unclear why this one was made of stone. You are currently forbidden from climbing up the pyramid. This is in reaction to the death of an 80-year-old tourist who fell in 2006. I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but she may have actually been screwing around. I've read that she was kind of an Indiana Jones type despite her age. This box, next to the snake, was found in front of the pyramid and contained a number of sacrificial items made of coral, obsidian, turquoise, and human bone. Next to it, you'll notice what looks like a doorway. For a long time, the pyramid was thought to be solid. There were no blocked passages, no tunnels underneath, but archaeologists in the early 1900s started to get an inkling that there might be something underneath it. So they started digging a tunnel in the north staircase in 1931 and headed towards the core before they found something amazing. Inside the pyramid of Chichen Itza is a whole-ass other pyramid, complete with temple on top. When the Mayans created a new construction, they rarely dismantled what previously existed in this space. They simply covered over it with rubble and built up. Modern experiments show there is actually almost certainly yet another pyramid inside of this one, though this one's temple may have collapsed. They've also realized that the pyramid is constructed directly above a cenote in 2015 with an electrical resistance experiment. The archaeologists in 1931 tunneled through the rubble in a straight line until they reached what were stairs of the original pyramid. You can see the rubble layer in the lower half and then corbelled ceiling, which was created by the explorers. We'll go up the stairs of the second pyramid. I'm not sure if the stairs inside were also reconstructed because tourists were allowed inside. Near the top of the stairs, there is a small platform, followed by 9 more stairs. The platform seems to be the top of the pyramid, and everything above it is just the original temple, called the Temple of the Red Jaguar. You used to be able to reach the entrance to the inner sanctum, but would be blocked from going any further by a metal grate. This is from tourist footage in 1995. If you get to the top and look up and to either side, you can see further excavation revealing ornate decorations. Seeing these intricate and huge structures while underground is such a bizarre thing. Looking through the gate, you'd see this guy staring back at you. It's called a chalk mule, complete with mother-of-pearl eyes, nails, and teeth, and it was discovered in 1935. Its lounging position likely represents a slain warrior carrying offerings to the gods. Human hearts would likely be placed on its belly. The temple was also full of rubble, and it took a year to find that there was a second room in August 1936. This one contained a beautiful red jaguar throne, for which the temple is named. It is likely a seat for a king or priest to observe a sacrificial ritual happening on the chalk mule. It's painted in cinnabar, which had to come from far away, and it's in pristine condition for its age. Its eyes are made from Guatemalan jade, and its fangs are white flint, still gleaming just like they did hundreds of years ago. Behind it, there are beautifully painted and carved columns. There are also carvings in the temple at the very top, but their paint seems to have come off, whereas these you can clearly see how brightly the Mayans painted everything. Between the columns, behind the throne, embedded in the wall, are 2 rows of human bones, seemingly femurs. Scientists are currently looking for a way into the cenote from nearby caves, as well as digging beside the pyramid to try to understand the inner structure, but they thankfully are unwilling to do destructive digging of another tunnel. This pyramid is far smaller than the ones in Egypt at only 30 meters tall. Various types of magnetic and muon technologies on the horizon should allow us to clearly see what's inside in the next decade or so without digging. I know a lot of my audience is American, and frankly, Egypt is a much harder vacation than Mexico. If you take a vacation to Cozumel or Cancun, take a day trip to some Mayan ruins and see up close what our ancestors could do in the Stone Age. I've seen them myself, specifically this one, the Temple of Tulum sitting right on the Gulf of Mexico. It's well worth the trip. You'll even get to hear the language of the Mayans, because although they'll probably speak Spanish to you, they still speak Mayan to each other. Thank you for listening. Discuss this wonder of the world in the comments. Think about what we've learned in Mexico that we can apply to Egypt, and subscribe if you wish to continue to explore the mysteries of our distant ancestors with me.